My name's Mary Marshall Clark, and I'm lucky enough to be the director of the Columbia Center for Oral History, previously known as the Oral History Research Office, founded in 1948, one of the first programs in the world. And so we have a really old and dusty archive, and we're gradually moving into the digital age, just digitizing that archive and creating new resources born digital, which we've been doing since 1996. I also have the great pleasure of being the co-founder and director of the Columbia Oral History Master of Arts degree, which is a first in the country, I hope not the last. So I have a kind of broad vantage point of looking at the field of oral history as we're trying to build it academically and publicly at the same time that we're still archiving and collecting interviews, and we're gradually trying to mix those things so that the students themselves, in going out and doing really pioneering projects, are actually building the field of oral history. And just to tell you what we do, a couple of the projects we're working on now have to do very much with the age of globalization, which I think is very relevant to the age of global media. And one of those started as the Rule of Law project, which really emerged from a very large project we had done on September 11th, and really its aftermath in New York City, in which we were able to cover not only the event, which was well covered, perhaps the best covered event in human history so far, but really the aftermath, the quiet things that took place in New York for months and years afterwards. And as a part of that project, we discovered the kind of backlash and the energy of the backlash against Muslims and Sikhs and immigrants generally. And it led us into doing a big, diverse digital project in New York City that then started to lead to other things. It started to lead to a number of things, thinking about the connections of New Yorkers with the rest of the world, thinking about how to document the global war on terror in a way that's representative of many, many different groups and many different factions. And out of that came a lot of thinking about the rule of law in our country. And so we started a project that began as a death penalty project, but ended up being a project on Guantanamo, on detention, on rendition. It's now going beyond Guantanamo. And I think part of our thinking about the global reach of that project, which has now become global, we've been to England, and we're going back to England, and we're going to Canada to interview someone, that we're really working in a highly networked sphere now that previously we didn't think about it that way. We thought about interviewing one person or another person and then taking all those individuals and putting them together in a big collection. Now we're working with networks of people who were displaced because of Guantanamo and other such black sites. So we're working with Mohsen Beg. We interviewed him, and he has a group called Caged Prisoners. And that is a network, a social network of people who were sort of picked up for, without good reason and displaced and interned and then spat out again all over the world. So we're trying to figure out how to get to Syria to find the people who've been sent there. We're going back to England, and we may be going other places, maybe just country by country, trying to catch up with the people and their families who were, wrongly interned and then displaced, to try to understand the global impact of Guantanamo and related sites. So that's something that we can do because of our facility with digital media, where we can really work in almost any situation, not only to gather individual testimony, but to utilize photographs and films made by other people about these situations. And so I think it's also led to a way of thinking about visual media and visual resources as a part and parcel of our work. We want to see people. We want to watch their faces when they're telling us the story of their imprisonment or their separation from their families. We want to interview the families themselves so that we can understand what it meant to lose family members. And all of this is because one of the fundamental purposes of oral history is to create difficult dialogues. Because of the openness of oral history as a form, and because of the way that we can listen to another, what Luisa Passerini talks about in terms of intersubjectivity, being not just the relationship of me to the people I'm speaking to right now, but to people who I don't normally speak to, and to people who don't normally know anything about me. So the gulf between the United States proper and the Muslim world is so huge right now that that is one gulf that we can work at trying to bridge through a methodology like oral history. And the inclusion of oral history in some of the more democratic social media type movements. There's now an Occupy Wall Street oral history project, and it's going to connect to a project in Egypt. It already is connecting. So we have, I sense, a larger vision of where we can go now. I really would like to talk about the changes that have happened in the last 10 or 15 years as we've transitioned from analog to digital media. At the beginning of those changes, it was simply that there was a lot of excitement about getting better sound, better picture, about not having to do FedEx shipments of analog tapes from one place to the other, but being to FTP files. So if we have an interviewer in India, she can send us back a file and the transcript will be on her desk when she gets back, that sort of thing. But gradually it started to change my way of thinking about oral history, because, oral history is, for so many years, been seen as kind of a subdivision of history, in which is a little scary to historians that we're working so close to the present time, where everything needs to be 50 years old before we can really touch it and look at it. And so with globalization and with actually the very vibrant international oral history community that we have, where it's really growing in all the continents, where we really have a vital international association and such, it came to be clear to me that we can think of oral history in new ways now. We live in times that are characterized by immense change, social, economic, political, and cultural change, where there are many things happening so fast that we have a sense of urgency about documenting them in the present. And also, as Andreas Hussin and other people have written about, the present itself is filled with memory cultures of all kind. And so I think that oral history is moving closer into the present, meaning we're being called upon to document crises as they happen and the immediate aftermath of crises, and to also try to use oral history to rescue traditions and languages that are being lost and all of that. So there's a way in which, through the digital media, and I don't mean just documentary media, but really doing online distance learning projects and teleconferences and the rest of it, we can kill distance, and just to give you an example of that, we have an ongoing relationship with a group in Sri Lanka where we're training a group of oral historians, journalists, and others to interview Sri Lankan youth in the three different ethnic groups that have historically been fighting with each other, and then using oral history to help them understand each other's political backgrounds and lives. And so we've done that entirely digitally. And the woman who is running the project there was a J School student here, and I taught her. That's how I met her in J School. Now she's running a big J School there. But so oral history is being introduced to Sri Lanka via digital media. And so we're going to have another teleconference soon to follow up on the several that we've had so far. We have a human rights advocates program at Columbia, and a couple of those advocates, one in Haiti and one in South Africa, that were here last year, are people we're staying in touch with and communicating with as they're doing oral history and human rights projects there. So again, that is something that I might not have imagined in the analog era, because also now we can share collections digitally. So it's not as though Columbia has to go to Sri Lanka to do oral history, or to South Africa. How arrogant would that be? It's that we talk with people about their own desires to build their projects, and we help them do that through sharing digital resources, through offering to collect and curate their digital resources, and really through Skype conversations. I'm not a fan of Skype oral history yet, but I probably will be eventually, tugged along. So I think it's changed my way of thinking, that we can actually use oral history to engage in difficult dialogues, to share cultural resources, and to complicate what the mass media would otherwise give us. I think the usefulness of oral history now is precisely in establishing context, which stories should be understood and read in. I'm actually writing an article about this right now called Oral History is a Long Song, taking the title from the great novel The Long Song by Andrea Levy. And it's about, in a sense, the story is about slavery in the mid-19th century in Jamaica. And so there was a narrator who compiled her stories. This is all fictive because there are really no oral histories from that period. And her son later finds the narrative and publishes it, but it's another 120 years before the author offers up the book. So the idea there is you may be able to document something in the moment, but it may be a century and a half later before it's really understood. So I like that because I like to think about the importance of establishing the context and the standpoint of what you're doing when you're doing it, and then imagining how it might be read later. We did that with our September 11th project in New York City, where we interviewed people starting days after 9/11, and we had this kind of radical openness towards the future that qualified everything we did. In fact, we asked people to imagine that their interviews would be read 150 years from now. And so I see those interviews almost as prophecies rather than as historical documents. But we also did enough kind of empirical work that we established the context in which those narratives were taken. They couldn't be definitive historically in terms of retrospective work. But I think what we did that the mass media did not do and does not do is to establish the local context through which those interviews should be read. We were operating in a way in which the public meaning and memory was instant, presto. Within 12, 24 hours, we are a nation at war, we're all in agreement, this is what should happen. And our archive is filled with holes and contradictions and fractured memories and people who were upset with the invasion of Afghanistan or terrified or because we might be attacked again. In other words, there was no agreement, there was no collective memory. It was a memory full of holes and full of pauses and full of contradictions, even within the imaginaries of each person that we interviewed. So I think that oral history can play a very important role in relation to the mass media to establish specific temporal historical context. How did people feel when we went into Iraq? How was that different than when we went into Afghanistan? How is it different now, 10 years later? So I think oral history is very, very good about establishing a ground of meaning from which these narratives can be understood over time and as narratives that are stuck in time and have to be read that way. The mass media just says this is what it means, and here it is, and that's the end of it. I think that the project Oral History in the Digital Age is such a fantastic project right now because though we're poised here in one of the great libraries of the country and we have tremendous support for going digital, our creative people are looking for how to think about what comes next. And quite honestly, there's so many different possible directions that we don't even know how to think about it necessarily. So we really need, whether it's called best practices or a way of thinking, Negroponte, et cetera, we need a new way of thinking about what is the digital age. Partly we need that because oral history is spreading like wildfire with the digital age. And so we need to be able, for those whom we teach, for the communities that we're working with, to say, this is the future and this is what you can do. To me, the best oral history comes out of knowing what you want to use it for. I have seen hundreds of projects over the years. The ones that always succeeded were the ones that knew where they were going to end up. Because the archive is not enough. How is this oral history going to work in the world? How is it going to change the community? Where will it live? How many people will be able to see it and access it over time? What camera should we be using? How many frames per second? How can we get the inexpensive equipment that we have to be able to teach and use at times up to the standard of being able to live a long life? These are questions that are necessary to ponder, and most of us, even in the field of world history here at Columbia, don't have answers to those questions. And we really need them, and we really need, as I say, a way of thinking about it, of making the tools very easy to use, of having a toolkit that's light enough that we can create meaningful exchanges. And I think of oral history now less in terms of documentary work than as a form of exchange, human exchange, a form of communication itself. So what is that form of communication, and how will it be enhanced by digital tools? Those are the questions I have.